Hi everyone, this is Adam. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to calculate position, best, and worst values for the metrics that we select. And this is important to recognize. We're also going to calculate team best and worst values or sport best and worst values depending on how your data is organized. And we're going to calculate the players all-time best and worst values so that when we are looking at this training camp or this session in question, we have the opportunity to compare them to themselves, the position, or the team. And I want to make a quick note here in that we're building all this stuff out. All these tutorials, they're more meant for showing you how to do things and the opportunities that exist than something that I would personally integrate into one of my own dashboards, because you should have a good understanding of what you want to compare, how you want to compare it, and what all of that means. But with that being said, to accommodate for everything, right, we're going to go through all these calculations and they're all more or less the same, but hopefully you benefit. In this video, we're going to do positional, best and worst values. So to do that, we're going to go to this chart data area, which is where we store information about charts that we create for our dashboards. And I'm going to call this I'm just going to say selected metrics. And if you've been following along, you might notice that the fonts are different and I add some colors. I'll do this periodically as I go through this chart data area and all the admin areas. I like to keep things as organized as possible and also be able to segregate things out and know what's going on. So I add some colors, add some bolding and stuff. But what we're going to do here is we're going to pull into this sheet the metrics that we selected. Just to do that, we'll go equals in one of these cells and go to our testing dashboard and select the cell, the first cell where we selected a metric, which is G5 in our case, or in my case, and click enter. And now we should see the metric name show up, and we're going to copy that and paste it down 10 times or however many metrics we have. And then we have all of our metrics in that order. Now that we have our metrics in here, we can calculate position values for these metrics. But let's start with average, because we've used average ifs before and I want this to seem familiar. And we've used this exact same calculation before, more or less. So what I'm just going to type over here, maybe I'll just say position average, and we'll use average ifs to do that. So we'll go equals average ifs, open parenthesis, and remember, we don't know what we're going to get the average of. What we get the average for is whichever metric we pick in our dashboard. So we're going to use index and match inside this average ifs, just like we did in the last video. If you need to learn again how to do that, you can look at the last video. We're going to go through it rather quickly. So we'll go index, open parenthesis. What do we want to get the average for? What could it possibly be? Well, let's go to our testing data set. And it could be anything between cell A1 and CL. So I'm going to hold down shift and click on CL. Take this back to A1, comma. Now what row do we want to get the information from? Well, we're going to define that by our other average ifs criteria, so we don't have to worry about it. So we'll just skip that for now because it's optional, so do comma. And now what column do we want to get the average for? Now we need to know that. And to do that, we're going to use match. So match, open parenthesis. I'm just going to type in the number 1 for now. So we'll match the number 1, comma, to the range, which is the column headers in this sheet. Because we want to find, this will ultimately be the metric that we pick. We want to match it to the column header in this sheet and get the average for that column. The comma 0. And I'm just going to close off the parentheses for now and click enter. And we know that there's an error here. Now, change the number 1. We'll change the number 1 right here to be the metric that we pick, which is right here. It comes through. and let's remove one parenthesis. So now we know what column we want to get the average for. It's whatever metric we pick right here, and we're looking for the column headers in our database to find it. But now what else has to be true for us to get this average? We want a position average for the session in question, right? So what other criteria do we need? In this average ifs, now we know what we're getting the average of, comma. Now what criteria range, or what criteria do we need? The first is when the position in our database is equal to the position of the player that we select, which is right here, a forward. So we'll go back to our testing database, and let's select position, column C, comma, when the position in our database, comma, is equal to criterion 1, which is, if we go back to our chart data, this position, or the position of the person that we select, comma, what other criteria do we need? Criteria range 2 is and also when, in this case, because we have multiple teams, and this is something that you'll need to decide on, right? I want the average for the position within the team that I selected. So for example, there might be forwards on other teams, or you might have soccer forwards and basketball forwards. If you wanted an average of all the forwards, regardless of sport or regardless of team, this would be fine. But I want it for the position and the team combination. So another piece of criteria we'll add is when the team in our testing data set, so when D, column D, comma, is equal to, let's go back to our chart data, the team of the player that we selected, comma, and also when, finally, when the session in our data set is equal to the session that we selected. So let's go back to our testing data. And the event ID, I guess, is what we're calling it, comma, is equal to the event that we selected. And I'm just going to close this off for now and click enter. And now we should have the position average, or the forward position average for the Monstars for Training Camp 2020. And that's what we have in this cell. Great. Let's lock some things in here, because we actually will calculate the position average anyhow. So let's lock all this stuff in, and then we can copy and paste around. So $sign before the A, before the 1, before the CL, before the F, but we want to drag it down, so not before the 5. Before the 1, before the 1, before the C and the C and the A and the 7, and the D and the D and the A and the 10, and the H and the H and the A and the 13. All that stuff. And let's add an if error. So we'll say if there's an error, if error, open parenthesis, if there's an error with any of the stuff going on in here, what do we want to happen? Comma. There's an error with anything going on with the value, which is that entire formula. We want it to be quote, quote, or blank. Close the parenthesis and click enter. And now, because this is dynamic and it's looking at each of these metrics, we can copy this formula and paste it for all of them. And we should have the position average for all of those metrics. Now we're going to go over how to do the position best and worst. However, they're a lot more complex than the average, because we don't know, or we do know, but the position best, or any best, it depends on whether lower is better or higher is better for the metrics, which is why in our admin area we set up these checkboxes to say, hey, this is lower 10-meter sprint times are better, 20-meter sprint time lower is better, body fat, whatever it might be, so that when we perform these calculations, we can do them appropriately. Because if we don't know if lower is better, then we're just getting maximum and minimum values. And a maximum value might not be better, right, for 10-meter sprint time and 20-meter sprint time. So let's start with the maximum and minimum values. And to do that, it's super simple. That's one of the reasons why I love average ifs, is because we can copy this formula that we have here. We can paste it right next door and change average to max and click enter. Now we have the maximum value for the position for that team for the session that we select. However, one more piece of criteria that I want to add to this maximum formula is that I want to only get the maximum when it's greater than 0. And we're going to do the same thing for the minimum. The reason for that is if you don't have any data, then it's going to give you a 0 value instead of no value. So it's not necessary, but it could be important depending on what you're doing. So to do that, it's going to look a lot more complicated, but the concept is actually really simple. All we need to do is we need to find the column that we're getting the maximum for again and find out whether or take all the values that are greater than 0. And to do that, we just use this index match thing that we already created. This whole thing right here. It's a lot of words, a lot of stuff, but we can copy it. And after this comma, we can paste it again and then do another comma, because now this becomes a criteria range in the average ifs. So we're saying that for the criteria range in the average ifs, we want to get the column, or all the values in the column for the metric header that we select. And the criteria now, right here after this comma, before testing data C2C, is quote, greater than 0, end quote. And then another comma to start the next criteria range, which is testing data C2C, which is the position is equal to the position of the person that we select. So we just added in another piece of criteria for this max ifs, and we can click enter, and notice nothing has changed. But now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get the minimum value also, because we don't know whether higher or lower is better yet. So let's copy this formula that we just did with max ifs. We'll paste it right to the left here, and we'll change max to, we'll change the word max to min, and click enter. So now we have the minimum and the maximum values for the position of the player that we selected and the team of that player for the session that we selected. Now, the last thing that we need to check for is we need to figure out which of these values to take. And the way that we figure that out, and the reason why we need to figure that out, right, is because if it's a 10-meter sprint, we would want the minimum value. If it's the 10-meter jump, we would want the maximum value. So how we figure that out is we need to figure out whether or not the metric that we picked has their checkbox checked. And to do that, we're going to use index and match again. So you're getting a lot of familiarity here. So let's check for the checkbox check right here. Do equals index, open parenthesis. Now what do we want to bring back here? We want to bring back whether or not the checkbox is checked, which is true or false. So we'll go to our admin area, click on column F. So we want these are all going to be true or false. We want to bring that back as our reference, comma. Now for the row, we need to match. So we want to match the row because each of these are rows, right? We're dealing with columns anymore. We're dealing with rows. So we want to match, if we go to our chart data, whatever metric is here, comma, 2, we want to match that to, if we go to our admin area, all the rows here, and figure out what is in the checkbox when those two things match up. So we'll go comma 0 and close off the parentheses and click enter. And we have false. Now what happens if we check the checkbox next to CMJ average? So let's go to our admin and let's check it and go back to our chart data, and now we have true. That's exactly what we want. Now we know whether or not the checkbox is checked. Let's uncheck it again. And the last thing that we have to do here, okay, I'm going to call this, we're going to move this over, and I might do some reorganization, but we'll call this position best, and we'll call this position worst. And I'm actually going to move this formula over here so that I can combine all three of these and show you how to do it. Okay, so now that we have these three values, we can go for the position best and say equals if this, whatever this is, which is whether the checkbox is true or not, or whether lower is better or not, if that equals true, comma, if that's true, then we want to get the minimum value, right? Because lower is better. But if it's false, comma, then we want to get the maximum value. And close the parenthesis and click enter. And we're going to change this if you want, or if you already have these things and you don't want to, you can copy and paste them, but we're going to combine all three of these formulas together. But let's copy and paste this down. So let's copy this formula that we have in here, and we'll paste it down through all these cells. And let's copy all the formulas we have in here, and let's paste them down to all these cells. We're just going to check and see if it works. Okay, so body or 20-meter sprint is true. Lower should be better, so our best should be 2.85, or the lowest value, and it is. Right? It is. Perfect. And for something where the checkbox is false or higher is better, we should get the maximum value for the best. And we do. So perfect. It's working as we want. I'm going to undo a bunch of stuff. I'm going to undo everything that I just did. And we're going to use the same formula. Copy and paste the formula up here into this cell. You don't have to do this, right? And just leave that there. But with this one, we're going to exchange what's in each of these formulas for what we have in here, right? So if G5 equals true, well, G5 is this equation that we already wrote to figure out whether the checkbox is true or not. So let's go back into this formula that we have to find out the best and replace G5 with that index and click enter. Nothing has changed. Instead of referring to this cell, we're now using the formula inside of it. Now, if that's true, we want to do 8. We want to get H5, which is the minimum value for the criteria that we set out. Instead of referring to H5, what we can do is go into this formula, everything except for the if error, copy it all, go back into our original formula, and replace H5, and maybe I'll separate it by a line there by holding Alt and clicking enter. We'll paste it, and click enter. And notice there's no change again, right? We're just replacing the reference that we have with the formula inside of it. So now we're looking at I5 for the last part of this formula. And instead of looking at I5, again, everything except for the if error and the comma and the quotes and the blank, we'll copy the max ifs in here, go back into our original formula and replace I5. And again, I'll do a Alt enter to separate lines so that we can see the difference, and paste the max ifs in there. And now if I click enter, it's still the same. And now we can remove these cells, and we don't need them to calculate this position best. We can copy it and paste it down if we want to, but before we do that, I'm going to add on an if error because I always do. So the always last, I always add it on last. So we'll go if error, open parenthesis. So if there's an error with anything going on in here, comma, let's make it quote, quote, or blank. Close the parenthesis and click enter. Then we can copy this formula and paste it to all these cells. And now we have the best in every category. And if we want to invert this, we can copy this formula, right? Paste it to the worst. Oops, what I should have done first, I was not very smart about this, is let's lock in the F's, the F here, and the E and the E. This is why locking in cells is so important when you're copying and pasting everywhere, because we want it to work. I'm going to copy that formula and paste it down again so that it applies to all these cells with the cell locking. And we'll copy the formula and paste it over. The only thing that we need to change now to get the worst is change true to false. Because now we're saying if the lower is better is false, or in other words, if higher is better, we want to get the minimum value for the higher is better value, which means that we're getting the worst, right? If higher is better and we're getting the minimum, that's the worst value in that for that variable, and vice versa for the lower is better. Now we're getting the maximum value for the lower is better variables. And if we click enter, now we have the worst, and we can paste that to all those cells. Now we can kind of see there's the position average, there's the best, there's the worst for each of these variables, regardless of whether higher is better or lower is better, because we have that defined in our admin area. I'll change this just to worst. And that's it. I've gone way over time, but hopefully this was helpful. This is going to make the other videos where we calculate team and player best and worst values a whole lot easier now that we have this framework down. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.